So now I opened this generated folder, which we generated with the Vue create command, the Vue first app folder in my case. I opened it with Visual Studio Code, with the editor we've been using thus far, simply with File Open, and then by picking that whole folder which was created. Now in that folder, you see a bunch of files and also subfolders. In my case, I got a Node Modules subfolder, a public subfolder, and a source subfolder, and then, well, a bunch of files. And that's the project setup the Vue CLI generated for us here. Now let me quickly walk you through the structure we have here. On the root level of this project folder, we have a bunch of configuration files. You don't need to care too much about them. Unless you know what you're doing, you can leave all the defaults there. The package.json file is interesting. This in the end defines the scripts we can execute, like npm run serve, which we started to start the development server. And under the hood, you can see those scripts all seem to use something from the Vue CLI. So they're doing stuff that has been pre-configured for us. We also have dependencies here, and there, for example, you see Vue, the framework, as a dependency. These are packages which are now available in our code. And package simply means that this will be imported and added to our code automatically. We don't need to add any script tags in any HTML file to have those packages available. Throughout this course, we're going to add more packages, but for now we can start with these packages which we have here. We also got certain development dependencies. These are also packages, but only packages which our project setup here uses under the hood. For example, the development server is in one of those packages. So these are all packages which we don't have to care about. These are packages which we're going to use actively or implicitly when we write code. Now that's it for this file. We can ignore all the other files for now and instead have a look at the other folders. Node Modules in the end houses the packages mentioned in package.json. Here we specify that we need them. npm, the Node Package Manager tool, which we installed together with Node, then in the end goes ahead and downloads those packages into our project and stores them in the Node Modules folder. It does that with a specific command you can run. In the terminal, if we quit that running development server, which you can do with Ctrl+C, you can run npm install to tell npm to have a look at package.json, download all those dependencies into a Node Modules folder, and well, then they're available. And once that npm install process finished, which you don't need to do right now because the Vue CLI did it for us when it created the project, once that finished, you can again run npm run serve to bring up that development server again. And by the way, you should keep that server up and running. You should keep that process up and running because you can only test your app as long as that is running. If you're done for the day, you can quit with Ctrl+C. But if you're starting to write code again in that project, you need to run that server again. That's an important note here about that server, that it should be up and running whilst you're writing code. npm install is required whenever you share a project without Node Modules, for example, like the future code attachments you will find in this course. Then you need to run npm install once to make sure that all the packages are available. In a brand new project created with Vue create, you don't need to run npm install because Vue create, the command we executed to create the project, already did that for us. And that's the Node Modules folder. A lot of talking about that, but it is important to understand what it does. It contains our dependencies, for example, the Vue framework, and also dependencies of dependencies. That's why it's so big. You should leave the Node Modules folder alone. Don't change code in there. Don't delete it. That will all impact your application in a negative way. You should just leave it here. The public folder is a very simple folder. Here, in the end, we got a HTML file, and this is a very simple looking file. That's, in the end, the file that will contain our Vue application in the end. You see it has a div with an ID app, and in the end, you will soon see that is where our Vue app will be mounted to. And we will only have one HTML file here since we're building a Vue single page application, which means everything we see on the screen will be controlled with Vue and JavaScript, and we'll just have one HTML file and use Vue to bring different things onto the screen. Now, all the imports that might be needed here and all of that will be managed automatically by the Vue CLI and by that development server. So we don't need to edit this HTML file right now. Instead, we have that source folder here, and that source folder contains the JavaScript code we're going to write. So it contains our Vue code in the end. And it is worth a closer look, because you can already tell there are some strange files in here. For example, a .vue file. Now, what's that about? The source folder contains all the JavaScript files we're going to write code in. In the end, the source folder is our main working directory. We're going to write our Vue application code in that source folder. The main JavaScript file here is the main entry point. And here you see we got an import syntax, which we haven't used thus far, but that is actually default JavaScript code, a modern JavaScript feature for importing functionality from one file into another file. And here we're importing the createApp function from the Vue framework. Before we used Vue.createApp, now we don't do that because now we don't have a globally available Vue object, but instead we can now import from the Vue framework and import things like the createApp method. And then we create an app with a configuration that seems to come from the app Vue file, more on that in a second, and we mount it to an element with an ID of app. And that's just this div here with the ID app in that index.html file. So that's how our Vue app ends up there. So it's a different way of calling createApp by using this import syntax, but we're going to use this import syntax throughout this course from now on, because this is the modern JavaScript way of exporting and importing features from one file to another. But what about this app.vue file? I mean, createApp always took this object with the data and so on. So why are we now passing app, which is coming from the app.vue file, to createApp? Well, let's see what's in app.vue. .vue files are a special Vue.js feature, or a special Vue CLI project feature, I could say. .vue file allow us to write Vue apps and, to be precise, Vue components specifically, in a much nicer way. They allow us to split our template, so the HTML code that belongs to an app or a component, the script part, and also some styles into 3 different sections here. You see, we have a template tag here in this Vue file, which contains the template of this app, a script tag, which contains actually this config object we saw before, just with different keys, which we haven't seen before. But this indeed is where you also would add your data. But we'll have a look at that in greater detail in a second. And we have a style tag here, which allows us to define the styles, the CSS styles that should be available in this Vue app. And this is a file which would not work like this in the browser, but which Vue CLI will transform behind the scenes to code that will work, so that we as a developer have a nice way of defining our Vue apps with 3 sections like this, and we still will end up with code that just works in the browser. But how exactly does this work? And why might we want this? In the end, the project which we created with the Vue CLI uses a so-called build workflow. That's a fancy way of saying that the code we write is not the code that runs in the browser. Instead, our code has certain features, for example, next-gen JavaScript features, but also Vue-specific features and syntax like the .vue files, which wouldn't work like that in the browser. if you try to load a .vue file with the structure you just saw in the browser, it simply wouldn't do anything because the browser doesn't know what to do with that code. But that's the important thing now. The project generated with the Vue CLI has a lot of under the hood tools working on our code to transform that code in a so-called build step to code that works in the browser. So that build step is simply just a couple of transformations being applied to our code to change that code to standard JavaScript code with standard JavaScript features that do work in the browser. And then the development or real web server that hosts our app is able to show something on the screen because it only receives regular JavaScript code that just works. And in the end, our project also has such a setup under the hood. In the end, the npm run serve script does not just spin up that development server, but also start this build process, which watches our code files and transforms the code. And that's why code like this here, with a separate template script and style tag, in the end is transformed to just JavaScript code, which runs in the browser. And this is a good thing because you will see throughout the course that those .vue files, also called single file components, that those single file components are a pretty convenient way of writing Vue components and writing Vue code. On the other hand, at the moment, it doesn't look too appealing because, well, my IDE does not understand this .vue file at all. It's just a bunch of white text, no syntax highlighting, so at the moment it's not really looking like a better way of writing code. Well, time to tweak the IDE, Visual Studio Code, a little bit as well. Thus far, we're using Visual Studio Code in a fairly simple and trivial configuration. Now it's time to install one extra extension that will help us with Vue development. For that, go to Vue, Extensions in Visual Studio Code, and there search for Vtur. This is an extension which you should install into your Visual Studio Code. I already got it installed, but I will need to enable it. And once you installed it, you will see that in those .vue files, you now do get highlighting, you now do have an IDE that understands those files. And with that, I can go to the Explorer view here. And now Vtur is an extension that does not just make Visual Studio Code understand .vue files, but which will help you with Vue development in general. So Vtur is a must-have extension for Vue developers. It will help you with auto-completion. It will ensure that you have a better development experience just by installing that extension. So now that we got this extension installed, that we got our project created and the running development server, let's see what else we got here in the source folder. We got this .vue file, which maybe is still something you need to get used to, but in the end, that's just a file that contains the configuration for a Vue app or a component, and then the template for that app or component. So what we previously defined just in the DOM, in the HTML file, or as a template string, which was pretty unreadable, what we defined like this before is now simply defined in such a template tag in a .vue file, in such a single file component. You also got an assets folder with a little image. That's in general where you would add images your app needs, and a components folder holding another Vue component. Now the exact code you're seeing here and also here might differ over time, by the way, but you should have some component in your components folder. And that is indeed how we will write Vue apps for the rest of the course. We'll split our code into components and compose our user interface and the entire Vue app by combining those components. And I'd say that's already enough of the talking about the setup. We now understand why we have it and how it works. Let's now go back to components and build up on such a Vue CLI generated project to dive deeper into components and again learn more about Vue. For this, I got a brand new project for you. You find it attached to this lecture. Simply download it, extract the folder, and store that folder anywhere on your system as you did it many times before, and you'll notice one important thing. This is a project which I created for you with the Vue CLI. So therefore here you don't need to create it on your own, you can just use this attached one. It is a project which I created with Vue Create though. I'm attaching it so that we're all using the same project setup. Now in here, you'll notice something interesting. The source folder is pretty empty. There's just a main.js file in there with not a lot of content. So therefore here, I got no Vue code, no Vue app, and no Vue components in there. And I'm doing this on purpose so that we can get started with that together and you learn step by step how to write Vue code and how to add Vue components in a brand new Vue project like this one. Besides that, we got the public folder with the index.html file, which I already explained in the last module. Now to get started writing code, there are two things which we need to do first. The first one is that we install all the dependencies of this project. So the dependencies mentioned in the package.json file, these dependencies and also the development dependencies. Because the attached folder, the attached zip file, has no node modules folder. Not because I forgot it, but because it's super big and the zip file would be multiple hundred megabytes big if I would have added it. That's too big and there is no need to add it because all you need to do is run npm install inside of that project folder. And here's the easiest way of doing that. In Visual Studio Code, in which you should open this attached folder, go to Terminal, New Terminal. And this will open up your default system terminal, your default system command prompt here as part of Visual Studio Code. The advantage is that you don't have to switch to a different screen and, even better, that you're already navigated into this folder. So you don't need to use the cd command to navigate somewhere else. Instead, this terminal already is navigated into this project folder. And therefore, in this terminal, you should now run npm install to install all the dependencies of this project. And whenever you're downloading one of my code snapshots, which you will find throughout the course, you should also run this command if you want to run my code, because all code snapshots attached to any lecture will be missing the node modules folder. So hit enter, and this will now download all the required dependencies and also the dependencies of dependencies, and it will generate this node modules folder and store all the dependencies in there. So let's wait for this process to finish. And once it is finished, we got the node modules folder, and we're now ready to get started running our development server. By the way, you can ignore that this file changed the color here. That's just because I'm using Git, a version control system as well, but you don't need to use that, so you can ignore that. So as a next step, let's now run npm run serve. This will start this development script which spins up the development server, and I'm doing this in the same terminal which I used for running npm install so that I do it in this project folder, which is where you should run this command. And now we got that development server up and running, and we should keep it up and running, as mentioned before, as long as we're writing code. This ensures that any changes will be picked up and we can see them on the served page. And the served page will even reload automatically whenever we do change anything. So therefore, we'll keep this up and running, and I'll just shrink it a bit so that it doesn't take up as much space, but I will still have it around. Now we can visit localhost 8080, and that's our running Vue application. And as you can clearly see, initially it's empty. There's nothing here. And the reason for that simply is that, well, we don't have anything here. We just got this main.js file, which creates an empty Vue app without any configuration. Well, Now that we got all set up, let's dive into writing some component code and let's learn more about components. Let's come back to the example you saw earlier in the course about this list of contacts. I mean, that is how we got started with components, so that's where I want to pick up. For that, here in the source folder, I will first of all create a brand new file and I will name it app.view. You don't have to name it app, but it is a convention to name your main file, which holds your main Vue app configuration, app.view. .view is the extension which I'll use so that I can use these single file component features in that file, having a separate template, script, and styling section. I like that a lot. It helps me split that logic and yet have it all in one place, and therefore we will work with such Vue files a lot throughout this course and in any Vue application you're going to build. So app.view it is, and now in here we can create two of these free sections you saw before. Create a template tag, opening and closing, like this, and create a script tag, opening and closing. We don't need a style tag for the moment, we'll add it later. Now I will emphasize again, this is not code that would normally work. It's also not a JavaScript file, it's a .view file. So only this Vue project setup knows how to handle it, and behind the scenes Vue will basically transform this all to just regular JavaScript code, which the browser will understand. But we're going to use this setup since for us as a developer, that will make life easier. And now in these script tags, we provide the configuration for our Vue app here. For the app, we want to mount to this div here in the index.html file. So therefore, we create a standard JavaScript object here, and we can also store this in a constant named app if we want to. And in here, we can now add what we learned about. We can add data, we can add methods, we can add computed, we can add whatever we need in this Vue app. Now for the moment, I don't need methods and computed, but here in my main app, I want to add some data, and therefore we'll return our object here as we learned it, and in there have my friends. Right? Because that is what we had in the component intro module as well. And there we had two friend elements where every element was just an object with an ID. For example, we had Manuel here with a name, which again could be Manuel Lawrence or whichever friend name you want to add, with a phone number where I just going to enter a random phone number here, and an email where I will also just enter a fictional email address. And then we can duplicate this to also have a second friend, and I used Julie before, so I'm going to repeat that name, Julie Jones, also with a random phone number here. And again, this is all really up to you. And here I have Julie at localhost. So now we got data in our app config object here, and if we leave aside how we use this object, because currently we're not using it at all except for storing it in this constant, if we leave that aside, it's just what we learned, right? We have an object with a data method where we return the data object. So that's all what we learned before as well. Now this should be the config object for our main app here. How do we now get this config object in the app.view file into our createApp method in main.js? Well, we're going to use this import syntax here, which you already see here. This is a modern JavaScript feature which we use in Vue CLI created Vue projects to combine different JavaScript files and export a feature in one file and use it in another. For that, we import something from, and then you point at the file from which you want to import. And here you should use a relative import starting with ./, which means it's in the same folder as this file, and then the file name, in this case, app.view. The import here looks a bit different. It's not ./view here, because here we're importing from a package, from this view package. And if you're importing from a package, you just reference the package name. But if you're importing from a custom file, like app.view, you specify the path to that file. Now that ... is not the valid syntax though. Instead, we could import a named export by using curly braces, or a default export. Now you might not know what the difference is. Here we're going to use a default export by just coming up with any name of our choice here and importing that from that file. And this identifier here is really up to you. It could be hello, it could be something, but typically you name it just like the file was named, because in there we have our main app configuration, so I'm going to name it app here as well. And this is now what we pass to create app, because app, what we import here, should just be this JavaScript object, this viewConfig JavaScript object. However, at the moment we're not exporting this here. To export it, we should rather not store it in a constant, which would only be available in this file and not in any other file, but instead we use a syntax which is also default modern JavaScript. Export, the export keyword, and then the default keyword. And this tells JavaScript that this object here is the default export of this app.view file. And that means that whenever we import like this, we're going to import that default. So we're going to import that object. So we're sharing this object from the app.view file to the main.js file, and therefore in the end we pass this config object to create app here. And we're splitting this in multiple files just to organize our code and to make every file focused on a certain task and therefore the overall project more readable, which will really shine if you're building bigger, more complex projects. So now, long story short, we got our app config object here. Now you'll notice one thing. This view app, which we create here in the end, has no template. We mount it to the div with ID app, but this is an empty div. Now, if we would have something in there, like a h2 tag, we could, for example, use view features in there. That's what you learned. But in Vue CLI created projects like this is typically not what you do. You leave that index.html file alone. Instead, that is what we have this template section for in a .view file. Here, we can now define the template of this Vue app. So here, we could now add a h2 tag and say, my friends. And then below that, for example, add an unordered list where we want to output all those friends here, like this. And we could also wrap this all into a section if we wanted to. So we can write our HTML code for this script here. And this is just regular HTML markup. Now if we save that all, and we go back to the page, localhost 8080, with the development server up and running, this page automatically updated without you reloading it to show our app content. So to show this parsed and rendered template which we defined for our main app. And that's how we work with those .view files and with a project setup like this. Now, this has nothing to do with components thus far. That's just a different way of creating our Vue app. But it's important to understand this because we will create components basically in the same way. So let's do that as a next step. Let's add our first component in this setup before we then really dive into component communication. So let's now add our first component, because this is just our main Vue app. But I mentioned before in the component introduction module that in Vue you have both. You have Vue apps and you have Vue components. And every component is like a mini app where you just have the possibility of combining multiple components into one app, and where eventually, covered in the next module, those mini apps, those components, will also be able to talk to each other. And you'll be able to build complex user interfaces by combining different components together. Now, it is a convention that you create a new folder, not a file, named components in your source folder to hold your components. Simply just to make it clear that these are now components and not just any Vue app. Now in here, I'm going to add my new friend contact.vue file to hold the friend contact component which I want to create. You might remember that is the component we created in the component introduction module. Now, if we have a look at the file name, just like with app.vue, I want to make clear what's inside of this file. It will be a component, otherwise it wouldn't be in the components folder, but it will be the component for displaying a friend contact. You could name this whatever you want. Could also just name it just contact. But since I plan on naming the component, the custom HTML element friend contact, I want to reflect this in the file name as well. And you could also name it like this. This is the so-called kebab case naming convention, but it is more common to use this Pascal case naming, where you have one word, possibly consisting of multiple words, where you start every word, including the word inside of the word, with a capital character. Now inside of friend contact.vue, since it's a Vue file, we can again create our template area here, and also our script area, just like before. And again, in the script area, I'll export a default object. This will be the configuration object for this component. Because keep in mind, an app component is like a small Vue app. It takes the same configuration object. So of course we need to export one. Now in the component introduction module, we then added a template key here to define the HTML code of this component in a string. We don't need to do this anymore. We now got this template area in the friendcontact.vue file. And that's exactly why we use those .vue files. It makes it much more convenient to create such components and define their templates. We don't need to do this in JavaScript strings anymore, where we get no autocompletion, and which is really just not fun. So instead here, I'm going to create my component markup. So that's the same markup I used in the component introduction module, a list item, and in there an h2 tag, where I output the friend.name, and then also a button below that, where I said show details, though we're soon going to make this dynamic. And then a nested unordered list in here, like this. Like this, where we then have two list items, one for the phone number, one for the email address. And here I have a strong tag where I say phone. And then here we output friend.phone. And on the second list element, we say email. And then we output friend.email. That's just the same markup we used before in the component introduction module. Now for this to work, we need to add the data field again here and return some data for this component, which is now specific to that component and only to that component, so which is independent from our main Vue app data. And there we had the details are visible property, which initially is false, which we'll use to make this button work and toggle this list. And we had a dummy friend property, which we'll later replace, but where for the moment I will just store manual so that we can output something here. Again, that is something we'll change later though. And now we will also need to add methods here in our config object. and add a toggle details method here to set this details are available to what they're currently not. And here I'm already getting better IDE auto-completion simply because we're in such a .view file and we got the VTour extension installed. So that's already one first advantage in action, which we have just by switching to this project setup with this extra view extension. Now we can connect our template here and add a click event listener to the button where we trigger toggle details and add vif here on the unordered list and check if details are visible is true and only show this if it is true. And now we got the finished friend contact component. Now we register it just as you learned it in the view component introduction module. In main.js, we create our app. We can store this app in a constant and call mount on this app. But then we can also call the component method here. And again here, I'm now getting auto-completion, by the way. The IDE suggests me that there is a component method, and it even tells me which arguments I should provide. And we provide a name, friend contact, and as a second argument, the config object for this component, which lives in a different file and therefore needs to be imported. So I'm importing friend contact from /. Now we need to go into the components folder, and in there we have friend contact.view. So that's the import path we need here to reach the friend contact.view file. And friend contact now again in the end just points at this JavaScript object which we're exporting in the friend contact.view file. And that's now what we pass as a second argument to the component method. With that, we unlock the friend contact component in our app. So we unlock this custom HTML element. And now in app view, here in our unordered list, we can add friend-contact as often as we want. And here I'll add it twice. And if we saved it all, it'll rebuild. And on our connected page, we'll see our components without the styling, because for the moment the CSS code is missing, but we see our components and it works just as before. Now, of course, it's pretty ugly like this, so let's next also see how we add styling here before we then ultimately learn more and new things about components. So let's now work on the styling, because at the moment this is quite ugly. There are different ways of adding styling, but I will show you the way you will most commonly use and which is the recommended way. You might remember that in our .view files, we not only had a template and a script section, but we could also add a style section. Now, adding it is optional. As you can clearly tell, it worked without it too. But here you can define the style of your app or component. So here I added the style section in app.view, and attached you find the styles CSS file which we used before in the component introduction module. You can simply download it and then copy all the styles you find in there and add them here between these style tags. Save your code thereafter, and if you now reload, you should have some styling back. Still not the final styling, but better than nothing. Especially our components don't look too bad. Now, to also improve the overall styling, here in the app view template, I'll wrap this h2 tag here into a header like this, and actually also convert it to h1 tag. And if we save that, this now looks better, and now we got our styling back. Now, there is actually more you can do with that styling here. You can, for example, later also lock it to a specific component to make sure that only that component receives the styling. But that's something we'll explore later. For the moment, the styling added here will do the trick. And with that, we now have a nicer project setup where we get this realistic development server where the app automatically reloads whenever we save a change, and where we also get better IDE support and in general have a setup which will not only work for small apps, but also for bigger apps. In this module here, we're going to pick up on this component concept and we're going to take it to the next level. You will learn how to build really reusable components and how to communicate between components. This will be super important because only with the knowledge you gain in this module, only with that you'll be able to build rich user interfaces in Vue applications with components. And you will see why components are such a powerful thing, such a powerful concept, and why modern Vue applications in the end are all about components. Now, for that, we'll get there step by step. We'll start building a user interface with components to get an understanding for how we combine these different building blocks. And we'll then also explore how those components can communicate with each other, which basically means how you can pass data between components. Because as you'll see, and as you actually already saw a bit in the component introduction module, passing data to components and between components will be an important concept. Now, last but not least, you will also see that there are different ways of communication, and you will learn which approaches exist and when you use which approach. So therefore, let's not waste any time and let's get started with working with components and with letting them talk to each other. So I am back in this project we set up in the last module. You find it attached. Make sure to run npm install and start your server with npm run serve if you just downloaded it. And you should see this on the screen on localhost 8080 here. So this is the dummy application we worked thus far, and we're using a component here. We're using the friend contact component, which we define here in main.js with app component. Now this friend contact component has one problem. It has one flaw. The data which we're outputting here, the name of the friend, the phone number, the email address, all of that is stored here inside of the component in this friend data property. Now that's a pattern we used a lot throughout this course. We stored the data a Vue app needs inside of that app. But for components, it often is a bit different. There, you sometimes want to create a reusable component, which contains the markup and certain logic, like here, the logic for toggling the list with help of the button. So that should be part of the component. But some data should be received from outside. And with from outside, I mean that the app or component which is using this component, so in our case, our main app here where we are using that component, that app here should pass data into our component so that when we use our component twice, we can use it with different data in each component instance, so in each HTML element we're creating here. So that the first contact outputs the data about Manuel, and the second time we use the component, we, for example, output data about Julie. That would be great if we could use a component like this, if we could use it as a reusable and configurable HTML element. And at the moment, it's kind of reusable, but every usage contains the same data, which is why we see Manuel Lawrence twice. Now, of course, there is a solution for this, because this is such a crucial concept, being able to configure the same component with different data when you use it multiple times. That is a core concept, and therefore it is something we can implement with Vue, with a concept called props. Now, what are props about? Props is short for properties, and you can think of props like custom HTML attributes. For example, here in app.vue, it would be nice if we could pass data to our first friend contact. let's say we would pass in the name, and that would be Manuel Lawrence. We would pass in the phone number, and that would be some number here. And we would pass in the email address, and that would be manuel@localhost.com, for example. And I'm going to hit that reformat shortcut to reformat it into this more readable version here. But it would be nice if we could use our friend contact component like this. And then here for the second friend contact component usage, we could pass in the same attributes, but with different data. So we could copy that and add it here. But now on that second friend contact, pass in Julie Jones with some data of our choice here, and here Julie at localhost. It would be nice if we could use it like this. Now, if we save that, it works, but of course we don't see that data on the screen. Because yes, indeed, you can set your own attributes, those so-called props, on components, but in order to use them inside of the component, you also need to write some code inside of the component file. So in this case, inside of friend contact. You basically should make Vue aware of the attributes, of the props that you want to accept on your component. So in our case, we want to make Vue aware of name, of phone number, and of email address. And we can make Vue aware of this by going to our component file, into the config object, and by adding a specific new key here, a new property which we haven't learned about before, the props property. And in its simplest form, this takes an array. I'm saying in its simplest form because we will later also learn about different ways of using that. But in the simplest form, we pass in an array, and in here, we should now specify all the props, so all the custom attributes, you could say, we want to accept on this component. And in our case, that would be name, phone number, and email address. So we could add name as a string. You add your props as strings to this array. So we add name, and then phone number, written like this. I'll come back to that in a second. And email address, also written like this. Now, why is phone number and email address written like this? Because what we define here as props will be available just like data properties in this entire Vue component, including in the template. So we could now refer to this with the this keyword. Here in the method, if we needed it, we could refer to this phone number, for example. And that's why we write it like this and not with a dash, because with a dash, this would be an invalid JavaScript property name. This would be invalid JavaScript code, and therefore props in your component should be defined in this camel case. And Vue automatically translates props defined like this into versions like this with a dash. So using this kebab case with a dash between words. And indeed, in your HTML template, you should use this kebab case notation. So here you should not use phone number, but phone dash number, to be in line with the rest of your HTML code, which also uses lowercase kebab case syntax. Might sound confusing at first, but it is really simple. In your HTML code, use this kebab case for props. In your component, when you define the props this component receives, use camel case instead. But the more important takeaway, besides that notation, is how that works. Now we're letting Vue know that our friend contact component has free props which it wants to receive. So free custom attributes which can be set when that component is used as an HTML element like we're doing it here. And now inside of that component, inside of the component file, we can work with these free props. As I just explained, we can work with them just as we can work with data properties. So inside of our JavaScript code, we can use this to access the different props or of course in our template, we can use them as well. And now we can say that here we want to output name, just name, not props.name or this.name, but just name. Just like we're using details are visible here, which is a data property. We use props in exactly the same way. And therefore, as a side note, you should of course make sure that you don't have any name clashes there. If you define something as a prop, you shouldn't use the exact same name in your data properties or computed properties. That's just a side note. But now here we can use name, here we can use phone number, and here we can use email address like this. And if we do that and save it all, now we see the component twice, but now every component works standalone and has its own data. And that is the amazing part here. That's the amazing thing. This now hopefully shows you why components are such a great concept in Vue and in programming in general. Now we can define the markup and the logic for our component once, but then use it as often as needed with different kinds of data in our other components or in our main app as we're doing it here. We built our own HTML element with its own markup and its own logic, and we made it configurable to ensure that the same element can be used multiple times with different data. So props is a core concept. We're going to use it all the time throughout the entire course, and it's the core concept to make components really useful and really powerful.